Hopefully all Bibles are open to the book of Ecclesiastes, a wonderful book of wisdom. All right, this ought to be fun because for some reason my notes are not working. All right. So over the last few months, I've preached a lot of topical sermons. And I got to thinking, I really want to get back to the basics, really get back to just, instead of preaching on different topics, let's get back to just studying God's Word. They, called it in Bible college, exegetical preaching, expounding upon the text, letting the text speak for itself. And so I got to thinking, what would be a good book to dig into? And I thought, Ecclesiastes is a book that I think could be very beneficial. Ecclesiastes deals with the question, what is our purpose? Why are we here? In particular, it asks and answers the question, what is the whole duty of man? When Solomon wrote this book, that is basically the subject matter he was dealing with. What is the whole duty of man? When we go to verse 1 of Ecclesiastes, I actually want us to read these first 11 verses together. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, we'll start in verse 1. It says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also the sun rises and the sun sets and hastens to its place. It rises there again, blowing toward the south, then turning toward the north. The wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full to the place where the rivers flow. There they flow again. All things are wearisome, man is not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. So there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one might say, see this, it is new? Already it has existed for ages which were before us. There is no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still." As I said, when we begin to look at the book of Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes deals with the question, why are we here? What is our purpose? In particular, what is the whole duty of mankind? Now, one may think, if we're going to answer that question, shouldn't we start with Proverbs instead of going right into Ecclesiastes? Well, you see, there's a little bit of a difference between Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Proverbs is a book of enlightenment. It is a book of encouragement, explaining to us the great value of wisdom. On the flip side of that, though, you have the book of Ecclesiastes, which is written from the perspective of an old man looking back over his life and asking the question, is it all worth it? It's kind of like the difference between talking to a new recruit versus talking to an old soldier. That new recruit is ready, he's refreshed, he's ready for the fight, can't wait to take on the enemy. But you talk to that old soldier, he's experienced a thing or two, he's seen a thing or two, and that really shapes his perspective. When we look at the book of Ecclesiastes, what we see is a book of wisdom written from really an older man's perspective. And this morning, we're not going to necessarily dig into the text all that much, but what I want us to do in our time together this morning is just understand a little bit more about the book of Ecclesiastes. And the first thing I want us to look at is the context of Ecclesiastes. The context. So first of all, you have the title Ecclesiastes. This word comes from the Hebrew word kohelet, which just simply means preacher, or the one who calls together. We get the word Ecclesiastes from the Greek translating of this Hebrew word. As far as the author, pretty straightforward. Biblical scholars don't argue about this. Solomon even self-identifies in verse 1 as well as verse 12 of chapter 1. There's really no debate among scholars who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. As far as when it was written sometime before 931 BC, and that is because that is when Solomon dies and the kingdom is split between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. So we know it was written toward the end of Solomon's life, but we know it definitely had to be written before 931 BC. As far as the main theme of Ecclesiastes, it can be summed up in this statement: life apart from God is meaningless. Over and over and over again, he will say, vanity of vanities, just like he says in verses 1 through 3. In particular, verse 2, he says, vanity of vanities. Or literally, if you want to think about it in a more exact sense, futility of futilities. It is all futile. It is all meaningless. It is all pointless. He says in verse 3, what advantage does man have in all his works? His work which he does under the sun. What is the point? What is the main theme? It is that life apart from God is meaningless. And all of this leads to the ultimate conclusion in Ecclesiastes. And if you want to talk about a key verse, the verse that David read for us a moment ago in Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. This really sums up the conclusion. He says, the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep His commandments, because this applies to every person, or as some translations say, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. The theme of Ecclesiastes is that life without God is meaningless. Thus, the ultimate conclusion is that our purpose here is to fear God and keep His commandments. Why? Because ultimately there is judgment coming. Everything, whether it's hidden or in the light, will be brought to judgment. Yes, this world is full of injustice. Yes, this world is full of evil. Yet there will come a day in which judgment will come. And the righteous judge will judge accordingly. Now, that pretty much sums up the context of Ecclesiastes. But I also want us to look at this morning just a brief outline of Ecclesiastes. And I think this is important because if you're like me, what sometimes happens is you'll think about a certain subject, or a question will come to mind, and you think, well, where's that in the Bible? And one of the things that I like to do when I study a book of the Bible is kind of have a heading for each chapter. What does this chapter talk about? And so when we begin to look at Ecclesiastes, you can really put the first two chapters together as its introduction. And the first two chapters is really a synopsis of Ecclesiastes. In the first 11 verses of chapter 1, he talks about how life is meaningless. Remember, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. He talks about how life is meaningless. Then in chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 11, he then talks about all of his pursuits to find meaning and purpose in life. He talks about how he tried the arts, he tried agriculture, he tried the work of his hands, his power, his influence, his wealth. All of these different things he tried to find meaning and purpose in life, and ultimately he found that it was all vanity. And that is his ultimate conclusion. That a life without God is meaningless. We see this in chapter 2, verses 12 through 26. In particular, I don't have a slide for this, but if you look at verses 24 and 25, I'll just read 24 through 26 of chapter 2. It says, there is nothing better for a man than to eat and to drink and to tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen that is from the hand of God. For who can eat and drink And who can have enjoyment without him? For to a person who is good in his sight, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while the sinner has been given the task of gathering and collecting so that he may give to the one who is good in the sight of God. This too is vanity and striving after the wind. Now you can look at chapters 1 and 2, and if you want a brief synopsis of everything that Ecclesiastes talks about, chapters 1 and 2 pretty much cover all of the bases. But of course, Solomon doesn't stop there. He wants to expound on these other subjects as well. So you move into chapter 3, and chapter 3 talks about the natural man's view of this life. In verses 1 through 9, you have how he talks about how there's a season for everything. This is the classic, this is the passage where the class, I can't remember who sang it, but, in every season, turn. David, who sings that? The Birds, yeah. I couldn't remember off the top of my head. The Birds sing that song, and this is where we see there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to reap, a time to sow, a time for peace, a time for war, etc. He says there is a time for everything, a season for everything. And then in verses 10 through 15, he talks about how God has set eternity in the hearts of men. In particular, in verse 11 of chapter 3, he says, "For he has made everything appropriate in its own time. He has also set eternity in their hearts. Yet man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end." And verse 11 of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is very important because it's this concept that is brought up so many times, especially in the New Testament. In Paul's writing in Romans chapter 2 in particular, he talks about this. How the Gentiles, when they follow the law of God, are a law unto themselves. Why? Because they have the law of God written in their hearts. In chapter 1 of Romans, Paul says that we can see the natural world around us and seek after God. We're without excuse. In Acts chapter 17, you have Paul talking to those Epicurean and Stoic philosophers at Mars Hill, and he says that God has created the natural world that we may seek after Him. He talks about reaching out in the darkness, trying to feel for God. So this concept that is talked about in Ecclesiastes 3, in particular verse 11, is very, very important, and it's used many other places in the Scriptures. Chapter 3 ends in verses 16 through 22 talking about the prevailing of injustice. Yes, God has given man a task. God has put eternity in our hearts, but what does man do with it? Well, we have injustice in the world. We have suffering. You get to chapter 4. Chapter 4 talks about all of these different societal evils. It talks about the evil of men in verses 1 through 3, the vanity of selfishness in verses 4 through 8, value of friendship in verses 9 through 12, and he ends it in 13 through 16, talking about the vanity of fame. There's no point to trying to gain notoriety. You get to chapter 5, and chapter 5 is one of the first chapters where we see kind of a really dark side of Solomon, where he talks about, yes, you need to fear God, and yes, it is vanity to seek after wealth, but ultimately in this life, and we know he's talking in the context of a life without God, he says there's no point. You might as well eat, drink, be merry, lest tomorrow we die. You get to chapter 6. Chapter 6 talks about the vanity or futility of life. In particular, in verses 1 and 2, he talks about the vanity of riches. In verses 3 through 12, he talks about the vanity of a long life. And there's a lot of insight in verses 3 through 12. There's a lot of insight throughout this entire book, but I especially find verses 3 through 12 to be rather interesting because this is an old man, as I've said, looking back at his life, saying, was it all worth it? What is the meaning of it all? In chapter 7, you have this contrast of wisdom against evil. In verses 1 through 24, he says, well, the wise man's going to do this, but the foolish man's going to do this, and this back and forth. And then in verses 25 through 27, he talks about the wisdom concerning evil women. Now, Solomon would know about this. You go to 1 Kings as well as 1 Chronicles, and when it talks about Solomon, it talks about how he built the temple, it talks about how he did all these wonderful things, but then in both 1 Chronicles as well as 1 Kings, it tells us that Solomon's heart was turned away from the Lord because he wanted to seek after foreign women that were idolatrous, that did not serve the Lord. So Solomon writes about that in chapter 8. He talks about how he should obey those in authority, verses 1 through 5. He talks about the uncertainty of life in verses 6 through 9, but then in 10 through 13, he flips that. You have the uncertainty of life, but then you have the certainty of God's judgment. And he ends the chapter in 14 through 17 talking about how man cannot know God's ways. In chapter 9, once again, this is a chapter very akin to chapter 5, where we have this eat, drink, and be merry, what's the point kind of chapter, kind of dark. In chapter 9, he talks about how life without God is meaningless, so you might as well just enjoy life. He says in verses 1 through 6 how we're all going to die, we're all going to come to an end one day, in 7 through 10, so you might as well just enjoy life, enjoy your friends, enjoy your family. And I find verses 11 through 17 to be rather intriguing, because he talks about how wisdom is great. It's great to seek after wisdom, but you need to understand, the world is not going to appreciate it. You may be able to give the world great advice and great wisdom, but ultimately they're probably not going to listen to a word that you say. It's going to go in one ear and out the other. This is one of the big differences, as I was talking about, between Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Proverbs is almost this idealistic book about seeking after wisdom. And Solomon, when he writes Ecclesiastes, is saying, well, yeah, you need to seek after wisdom, but just temper it a little bit. Just slow your roll a little bit. Understand that it's great to seek after, but the majority of people just aren't going to care. It's dark, but it's the truth. In chapter 10, you have this, once again, contrast of wisdom. I say it's the dichotomy of life, so basically it's the divide of this is what the fool is going to do, this is what the wise man's going to do. And he gives these woes in 16 through 20. Chapter 11, though, he talks about the law of reaping and sowing, how you're going to get what you put into it. You're going to get out of it what you put into it. But then you get to 7 through 10, and he gives this advice to young people. And this transitions right into chapter 12. In fact, if you read it as you would read a manuscript and take the chapters out of it, it actually makes a lot of sense. He gives this advice to young people, but then you get into chapter 12. In the very first verse in chapter 12, he says, remember the Creator in the days of your youth. He's telling them, listen, you need to remember God when you're young, because when you get old, you become a little more skeptical, you become a little more cynical about the world around you. And then he ends Ecclesiastes in verses 9 through 14 with the ultimate conclusion, as was read for us earlier and we looked at a moment ago, that the ultimate duty of man is to fear God and keep His commandments. Now, that is basically what I would call a crash course in Ecclesiastes. That's just an outline. Over the next few weeks, we're going to actually get into the text and really dig into some of this subject matter, but I know we haven't really done that this morning, so as we're going to pull all this together, I want to end by asking a question. That question is, why study Ecclesiastes? Why should this be a book of the Bible that we are concerned with? What would the purpose be? How can this benefit us? And there are three reasons that came to my mind. The first one is that our own experiences leave us inadequate. Our own experiences leave us very, very inadequate. There's a reason that Proverbs 1:7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but it is the fool that despises instruction and wisdom. When we are unwilling to learn from those that have come before, the only thing we have to go off of is the prism of our own experiences. Now, I know that's how a lot of people live their lives, but that's not very smart. In fact, that's actually pretty arrogant if you really want to break it down. That's pretty arrogant for someone to say, well, I don't need to study, I don't need to learn, I don't need to grow. in my life because my experiences tell me everything I need to know about the world around me. That's probably not going to work out too well for you. Something that I found very interesting, the general that was over the war in Iraq, General James Mattis. If you don't know who he is, Google him. He is what I would consider a warrior scholar. As was written about the warriors of old, he was a warrior poet. He is a warrior poet. This is a man who, in his writings, has said when he went to Iraq, he brought 2 books with him primarily. A copy of the Diaries of Alexander the Great and T.E. Lawrence's The 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Now, both of those deal with, involve people from the Middle East. And he understood this was not going to be a war won with bullets, it was going to be won by ideology, which is what Alexander the Great and T.E. Lawrence understood. He's truly a warrior scholar. And I found it interesting. In his book, Call Sign Chaos, probably one of the better books that I've read this year, this first quote at the top, he says, quote, "If you haven't read hundreds of books, you are functionally illiterate. And you will be incompetent because your personal experiences alone aren't broad enough to sustain you." He went on to say to a colleague who told him, "Well, I don't have time to study. I don't have time to read. I don't have time to learn." This lower quote came from an email. He says, quote, "The problem with being too busy to read is that you learn by experience or by your men's experience, i.e. the hard way by reading. You learn through others' experiences, generally a better way to do business, especially in our line of work where the consequences of incompetence are so final for young men," end quote. I think that Mattis hits the nail on the head of one of the primary reasons we need to study books like Proverbs, books like Ecclesiastes. Our own experiences leave us very inadequate. They leave us very unprepared to deal with the world that is around us. Thus, studying books like Ecclesiastes give us guidance. They give us wisdom. They show us in these different areas of our lives where we may be lacking things that we can do better or possibly do better ways. So the first reason is that our own experiences leave us inadequate. But the second reason I think we should study Ecclesiastes is that it is wisdom imparted from an aged perspective. Ecclesiastes is a book of wisdom imparted from an aged perspective. As I've said a couple times already, Ecclesiastes was written from the perspective of an old man looking back over his life saying, okay, what was the purpose of this? Was it all worth it? And we understand that on an intellectual level, but let's stop and think about how this directly applies to someone like Solomon. Solomon was smarter, wiser, more affluent, had more influence, had more power, had more wealth than any of us ever will, or anyone in our, even today, in our known world will have. And this same guy, at the end of his life sits back and says, was it all worth it? What was the point? A fellow that could have anything he ever wanted. Absolute power even. And he even is questioning this. One of the places in Ecclesiastes, I think this perspective is very clear, is in Ecclesiastes 12, when I alluded to this passage earlier. He says, "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them." He says, listen, when you're young and all idealistic, and you're not so cynical about this world, you need to remember God. You need to remember the joy of life. Because there's going to come a day when the evil of this world is going to get to you. You're going to be a bit more skeptical. You're going to be a bit more cynical. You're going to be a little bit more hardened because of the sin you see in the world. When I thought about this, it made me think about the first day I started work for the Tangipahoa Parish Sheriff's Office. I go into the parish jail, because they always start you in the jail. And they, you got your uniform on, your first day of work, you're happy, you're all smiles, you're you're so glad that you're starting this new career, and I'll have to say, even though I haven't worked for a law enforcement agency in 6 years, yeah, that idealistic person doesn't exist. It doesn't. Just plain and simple. You know, as you see and experience things, as the evil days come, you change your perspective. And I think this is something that Solomon gives to us. Something that we cannot impart to ourselves. I cannot be wiser than, without learning from others. Kind of like with the first point, I cannot be wiser than my own experiences. Thus, when I look at a book like Ecclesiastes, a book of wisdom imparted from an age perspective, then that helps me grow, it helps me progress. But probably the most applicable reason I think we should study Ecclesiastes, and something that I think is very true in our world today, is that it helps us cope with change. It is a book that helps us cope with change. You know, I referenced it a moment ago, but Ecclesiastes 3:1 says, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven." Change is inevitable. We can stop many things in our lives. We cannot stop the progression of time. We can't. We cannot keep things from changing around us in the world. We can't keep things from changing with the people that are around us in the world. We cannot stop change. It is absolutely inevitable. And when we study a book like Ecclesiastes, does it help us slow down change? No, it doesn't help us it doesn't help us slow down change, but what it does is it gives us better perspective on that change. You know, we talked this morning in our Bible class or before our Bible class, and Becky and I actually made mention of this last night, how, you know, you learn to grade everything on a curve. You know, like I remember before the pandemic really got going and people started, you know, panicking at the beginning. I told one of my coworkers, listen, this isn't I think it's like the 14th century, and Genghis Khan is at the Canadian border, going to come down and murder and pillage all the way to Miami here. You got to grade it on a curve. Could be a lot worse. Now, that's an extreme example, obviously. But something that Ecclesiastes gives us is more perspective on how to look at a situation, to look at the changes around us. Yes, it's inevitable, but how do we deal with them? We deal with them by gaining greater wisdom and perspective. And I also think it's interesting how in Ecclesiastes, where it talks about how change is so inevitable, it does point us ultimately to something that never changes, and that is the nature of God. And I go back, and this is going to be how we're going to close the lesson this morning. I go back to verse 14 of Ecclesiastes 12. You know, we've read this a couple times before. He says, "For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil." This world may change, people may change, political persuasions may change, all these things around us may change. But the truth of God doesn't change. God Himself, His nature does not change. And the ultimate fact, and probably the greatest lesson from Ecclesiastes, the greatest lesson that we can gain from a book like Ecclesiastes is the fact that, yes, life without God is meaningless. And, you know, we can look at life in this physical realm, we can look at life in this physical way. And as much as it changes, God will always stay the same. There's injustice in this world, but there is the righteous judge. Kind of what Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 4. He talks about how God, the righteous judge, you know, not the judge that's keeping him in a Roman dungeon, but the righteous judge will take care of things. And I think for me, as I've read over Ecclesiastes, preparing for this lesson, preparing for upcoming lessons, that's kind of the thing that goes through my mind the most. You see all this change. You see how there's so much evil and injustice in the world. Well, ultimately, the righteous judge will bring that to judgment. The righteous judge will bring everything to light. And as evil and as horrible as things can be in this world, that is one constant. And in a world where it's so easy for us to lose that perspective, a book like Ecclesiastes gives us wisdom, it gives us guidance, and it helps us have greater perspective on things that are going on in our lives and the things we see around us. And so with that, the lesson will be yours for this morning. We'll dig into Ecclesiastes chapter 1, getting into the text starting